Before we get started, this is a video that's been long awaited. Ever since the Spec Ops The Line one, I've had countless requests to cover this, and it's finally time to sit down and talk about one of the greatest films of all time. This is the end.
Well, you see, Willard, in this war, things get confused out there. Power, ideals, the old morality, and practical military necessity. Because there's a conflict in every human heart between the rational and the irrational, between good and evil. And good does not always triumph. Sometimes the dark side overcomes what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end, my only friend. The end of our elaborate plans. The end of everything that stands. The end, no safety or surprise. The end.
I told you not to stop. Now let's go.
Apocalypse Now. Yeah, this movie needs no introduction. This is a film so famous it's become a cultural landmark, quite literally, referenced countless times and going on to inspire contemporaries that still go on to this very day. It helped shape the modern perception of what a Vietnam movie is. A lot of times if a piece of media wants to reference Vietnam, it will in some way include a nod to Apocalypse Now. Some are more subtle than others, but they are there. Now, for those unaware, Apocalypse Now is the 1979 Vietnam War film directed by Francis Ford Coppola. It follows Captain Willard, played by Martin Sheen, a Black Ops soldier assigned to a mission where he must go upriver into Cambodia and assassinate a rogue Special Forces commander named Colonel Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando. What starts off as an already shady mission devolves into a harrowing journey of insanity and obsession, and by the end, Willard realizes that him and Kurtz have far more in common than he first thought. So Apocalypse Now is an extremely famous movie, to the point that it's kind of weird to even try to introduce it, since it's had such a massive impact on films. But you'd be amazed how few people actually know about Apocalypse Now, beyond some surface level details of course. They know Martin Sheen on a boat, they know Marlon Brando being so fat for the role they shot him in darkness, and they know about the general disaster it was to film the damn thing. Being such a clusterfuck, it spawned an entire documentary called Hearts of Darkness, exploring the factors that made filming such a nightmare. From clashing egos to nervous breakdowns, to Martin Sheen having a heart attack in the middle of the jungle. It's a wild story, something that fans of the movie should really sit down to give a watch so they can put things in perspective. Everything about this movie could have easily fallen to pieces if just a single thing went wrong, and they did, more than once. But the cast worked themselves to the bone to make it work. Hell, the story around Apocalypse Now is so infamous that the production became one of the inspirations for Tropic Thunder, with the setup being a film crew attempting to shoot a Vietnam movie that's plagued by problem after problem. Of course, this is just the production of the film, which, while disastrous, somehow managed to not actually affect the film in a negative manner. It's honestly impressive how, despite the film having so many hurdles it had to jump through, they managed to make something not just beloved by audiences, but considered one of the greatest films ever made. It goes to show that sometimes perseverance is exactly what a movie needs to be good, to be put under pressure in order for a diamond to pop out. Of course, that's not to say every film should be put under the same strain Apocalypse Now went through. For the love of Christ, don't make that the standard. Just that Apocalypse Now was a case where the crew involved managed to rise up to the challenge and make something special. But how did all of this start anyway? Well, this is the brass tacks of it. Apocalypse Now is based off the novella written by Joseph Conrad, Heart of Darkness. It follows a steamboat sailor named Marlowe as he sails up the Congolese River in search of a man named Kurtz. They're employed by a Dutch ivory company who have investments in the region, and Kurtz served as their representative, so him going missing is a very big deal. As Marlowe goes through his journey, he sees the way the native Africans are treated by the colonial Europeans who are investing into the continent. The whole point of the novella was to break down the idea of civilization, to ask who was the savage and who was the civilized one. There's a lot of scenes where the Europeans abuse the Africans, beating them or exploiting them in inhumane ways. Kurtz himself is revealed to have gone completely insane as he lived with the natives, propping himself up as a god king that's worshipped by the Congolese, all the while he's devolving into a blathering madman. Marlowe discovers Kurtz as he's dying of jungle fever, which is malaria, and he hears his final request, to hide all the documents and reports that Kurtz wrote during his time in the Congo, so nobody from the company can have them. And the final words he hears from Kurtz as he dies are simply, "The horror, the horror." Heart of Darkness is a very good story. Some say it's too drawn out or that's kind of dry, and I think a lot of that is because people are forced to read it in high school. The classic problem of old literature getting a bad rap because you had to read it during a time when you couldn't give two shits less. But the story itself is still good. It raises a lot of questions about society, human nature, and the depths someone can sink to. It's a very influential novel, inspiring works all on its own. Hell, if you ever played Far Cry 2, that game is basically a soft adaptation of Heart of Darkness. It has numerous references, takes place in the same setting, and it has a lot of themes of the story that are used in the game. I mean, hell, the final mission in the game is literally called Heart of Darkness, and you have to take a boat up a river in order to get to the final confrontation. It's kind of on the nose. Though easily the most famous piece of media inspired by Heart of Darkness and Apocalypse Now is Spec Ops: The Line. I did a whole video talking about this, which is a little rough. It was one of the first major videos I did, and still had some growing pains in regards to structure and pacing. But a lot of what was said I still stand by, and the point of this is to talk about Apocalypse Now influences. Now, this game kind of does its own thing with the source material, being much more of a condemnation character study of the protagonist Walker, compared to the others which focus on a mysterious figure built up throughout the story instead. Still, the DNA is 100% there and outright admitted to. The structures are usually the same, focus on a protagonist on an obsessive journey to find a mysterious figure, but each one handles their own themes and intentions with the story. Heart of Darkness is about tearing down the idea of civilization, to show supposed gentlemen devolve and become worse savages than the native Africans they thumb their nose at. Spec Ops: The Line is about condemning Walker and the idea of the military sim hero complex, that you are a super soldier coming in to save the day because you're awesome. Obviously spun on its head by showing Walker fuck everything up and make things leagues worse than they were before he got there. And Apocalypse Now, well, that's got its own themes to it. So the obvious thing to mention is that the setting is changed from the novel. Instead of being in the middle of the Congo, it's in the middle of the Vietnam War. Instead of focusing on a bunch of ivory traders and established gentlemen, it's American soldiers. Kurtz is now a colonel in the Special Forces, and Marlowe is now Willard, an operator for MaxDog, which was a classified program that focused on deniable missions. Yeah. So if you ever felt like Black Ops 1 had some Apocalypse Now vibes, you are not wrong. Still, Willard is burned out from his time of the war, but not in the way you think. He's not tired of being in the war. No, Willard is a very conflicted protagonist. The guy can't decide what side of the world he truly belongs in. During his first tour, he was desperate to get back home, yet when he was home, all he wanted to do was return to Vietnam. Sinking into such a powerful depression, it ruined his marriage. Willard battles these sides of himself through the whole film. The guy is stuck between becoming another face in the crowd and wanting to stay in the jungle until the day he dies. He's already losing his mind and slipping into darkness, much like Kurtz does in the story. So instead of being an outside observer, Willard sees an almost kindred spirit between him and Kurtz. As he reads through the dossier, he finds himself sympathizing with his situation and even respecting the man. So instead of condemning Kurtz or just painting him as pure evil, Apocalypse Now instead wants you to actually consider what Kurtz is saying, his methods, and think about the government's role in the problem. Because it's not just one man losing his mind from the horrors of war and causing further death and suffering. It's actually much more complicated than that. But before we go any further, I'm going to put up a spoiler warning for Apocalypse Now. It's weird to do this due to how famous the film is, but regardless, it's going up. I'm going to talk a lot about plot details and essentially give my own view on the movie, I guess. And it's a very good film. You should definitely sit down and watch before it goes any further. And yes, we are absolutely going to talk about the alternate versions.
I'm a soldier.
So the story around Kurtz is very interesting. He was a true patriot, giving up a chance at a career so he could join the Special Forces and help fight the war in Vietnam. He was exceptionally old for the job, being damn near 40 when he started training, yet he pushed through and became a commander. Despite being so well respected, Kurtz ran into numerous roadblocks during his time in the war, from bureaucracy to hypocritical moral judgments. One such example is that Kurtz murders a bunch of South Vietnamese officials he accused of being NVA spies. He sought no approval or permission for it, he just had them killed. This is the driving force that caused the government to order Kurtz's assassination, the mission Willard receives at the beginning of the film. We're led to believe it's proof that Kurtz lost his mind, suddenly ordering the deaths of people with no proof of betrayal, but it's later revealed Kurtz was actually correct. They were spies, and ambushes in Kurtz's sector dropped off to almost nothing once they were dead. Despite being right, he's still punished for his actions, which is what kicks off his descent into insanity. Kurtz despises the command in charge of the war. Now, Vietnam itself was a very contentious conflict and is such a massive shit show, nobody can even really agree on what really happened. Some see it as America completely fucking the pig and losing the war and the biggest embarrassment of the 20th century. Others see it as America being robbed of a victory through subversive means to convince the population they lost when militarily, America did win. It's a messy situation, one made messier by the fact it was a literal proxy war in the grand scheme of the Cold War. The North Vietnamese were bankrolled and armed by the Soviet Union and Maoist China in an attempt to cause a communist coup. The South tried to fight them off, but inefficiency and government corruption caused things to sputter out and never get much better. If you want to know how bad things got in regards to propaganda, here's a pretty famous picture. The execution picture was used the world over to push how unethical the war was and that the West needs to back off. But this is ignoring major context. For one, the man with the gun to his head was an NVA terrorist that had just committed the murder of a South Vietnamese police officer and his family, and was found next to a mass grave being dug for civilians supposedly murdered by the Viet Cong. Eddie Adams has been quoted as saying he regrets how much the picture has been taken out of context, since it became a major anti-war image despite the context around the incident showing it was much uglier than just bad man executes crying civilian, even saying his big regret was not getting footage of the man killing the family so the world would know for sure who he really was. Apocalypse Now is all about this debate. Not this debate in particular, but the ethics of war and what would it actually take to win something as nasty as Vietnam. How could you argue morality in something as grisly as this? What makes someone a murderer? Who gets to judge the murderer? Why is one murderer punished but not the other? These questions embody the spirit of the film.
Charging a man with murder in this place was like handing out speeding tickets at the Indy 500.
The reason why Willard sympathizes with Kurtz is because he shares similar beliefs to him, that war is something you do anything to win. Willard already embodies this by being part of MaxSOG, an already shady organization that performs assassinations against various targets around Vietnam. Willard himself had killed a tax collector some years before the events of the film, so the idea of going after Kurtz for murder sets off Willard's bullshit detector, because the men ordering them around are already amoral killers. They just send other people to do it instead of picking up the gun themselves. You see this difference a lot in the movie. The guys like Willard and Kurtz, and the guys who aren't them. The obvious one being the rest of the boat crew Willard is traveling with. They're a bunch of young guys who have been sheltered from the worst of the war for the most part. They've seen action, but they're still just guys in the Navy. They joke around, just seem to be killing time until they're allowed to go home. You have Chef, a Cajun from New Orleans who wants to be a cook. Clean, a young kid from the ghetto, played by a young Lawrence Fishburne, who actually lied about his age to get the role, which is one hell of a debut. And Lance, a famous professional surfer who's only really interested in doing drugs. You also have Chief, the actual captain of the boat who runs his ship as tight as he can. They all feel distinctly disconnected from Willard. He mainly keeps to himself and doesn't really talk to the others too much. He does talk to them on occasion, but everyone all around is kind of wary of him. The boat crew doesn't know where they're going, and they don't really want to know. Chef just assumes they're dropping off Willard so he can blow up a bridge. They make it a point that the boat crew doesn't really know who Willard is or even trust him that much. He's the outsider coming on board to tell them what to do. It's why they have such distinct personalities contrasting Willard. The guy is very quiet, introspective, and mainly just stays in his own head. He only really pipes up when he feels comfortable, and deep down, he has a dark side he tries to keep hidden from the rest of the boat crew, though it does creep out on occasion. It's why he's so fascinated with Kurtz, because he looks over at the rest of the boat crew and just sees a bunch of guys that don't really share his worldview. They're just a bunch of kids who flake out when things get serious. But to Willard, Kurtz is almost like the perfect soldier, someone who despises the hypocrisy of command, the lies they sell and punish people over, and someone who is willing to push himself to the limit and throw everything away because he truly believes in what he's doing. While Willard was ordered to kill him, he's not the first guy they sent in whatsoever. The government sent in multiple agents to try and whack Kurtz, one such being a man named Colby, who went missing during his operation and is actually brainwashed into being a member of his army, implied to have went down the same road Willard is doing, something that plays into the ending quite a bit. Now, the final confrontation is one of the most famous aspects of Apocalypse Now, when Willard and the surviving members of the boat crew finally reach Kurtz. They cross over into Cambodia and stumble into the rogue army the Colonel is building. They are woefully unprepared for when they finally get there, completely surrounded by the brainwashed followers and pagan idolatry that Kurtz has built up. The crew tries to scout out the temple, but they're quickly discovered and captured, with Chef being decapitated and Willard forced to sit down and talk with the man himself. Marlon Brando, despite the difficulties he's caused during production, he never read the script and didn't realize Kurtz was meant to be a very muscular man, so he came in severely overweight. He was a perfect pick for the role. The man holds so much menace with how he looks, how he talks, everything about him just sets you on edge. But despite that, the guy is very soft-spoken.
I was sent on a classified mission, sir.
No longer classified. Is it?
Never really raising his voice except for very specific moments, but the power behind his words is impossible to describe. And the best part? Most of his monologues are completely off the cuff. As stated, Brando never really read the script, so all of this is off the top of his head or very brief notes. It's really amazing stuff since his monologues are such iconic parts of the film. And to know it was all just improv Brando came up with because he was too lazy to read the script is kind of insane. Still, the monologues from Kurtz reveal exactly what his philosophy is, particularly the arms story. When Kurtz was with the Special Forces, they went to one of the local villages to vaccinate the children for polio. They left and returned to find that the Viet Cong came in and hacked off the arm of every vaccinated child, put into a pile. Kurtz, previously described as a very caring and kind man, is broken by the sight, horrified at the idea of somebody chopping off the arms of children for something as small as taking vaccinations from the enemy. But in the horror, he realized the genius of the action. The horror is the point, to make someone lose faith and wonder just what kind of monster was capable of doing something like this. But they weren't monsters. The men who chopped off the arms of the kids are still men. They are human beings. They were able to put aside their own beliefs, their own morality, what made them who they were, all to terrify the enemy. The point is to show you are willing to do anything to win. Anything. To put aside hesitation, fear, and instead weaponize moral terror to become so horrible your enemy cannot handle it anymore. As easy as it is to write off Kurtz as completely insane, he does have a sense of logic that he's working with. It's not random babbling. In fact, he's never like that. The man is operating off a philosophy, one that isn't completely unfounded. There is a strange hypocrisy in the idea of trying to win war in an ethical manner. As Kurtz himself puts it, they train young men to drop fire on people, but they can't write fuck on their airplanes because it's obscene. When you think about it and actually sit back, this really doesn't make any sense. What is the line before something becomes unethical in something like war? Murdering civilians? Torture? Rape? From Kurtz's point of view, none of this is off the table, because the very act of war itself is the breeding ground for all of these actions. If it gets the enemy to surrender, you do anything to break them. When the boat crew makes it to the temple, they see corpses and severed heads splayed about as a deterrent for trespassers. They are willing to throw away their humanity just for this ideal. And obviously, this is a tad controversial. The My Lai incident was bad enough when it went down. Saying that should be standard procedure might not be the best idea. But that's just how Kurtz sees things. If anything, he thinks arguing against this is just being a hypocrite and a liar. You're already dooming people to die by declaring war in the first place. Any tactic that guarantees it's resolved as fast as possible is something you need to do. And the movie itself does hint that Kurtz has a point. Before getting on the river to Cambodia, Willard and the crew have to stick with an air cavalry unit led by Lieutenant Colonel Kilgore, played by Robert Duvall. He has a following very similar to Kurtz. His men are extremely loyal to him, and he runs it all himself, making decisions on where they go and who they fight with very little oversight. Willard spots him miles away from the rendezvous point because they got bored and wanted to kill more Viet Cong. They choose the drop-off point for the boat purely because Kilgore hears that it's a good spot to surf, so he sends his men to take the beach based on this whim, and they're happy to do it. Now obviously it wasn't just because Kilgore wanted to surf, it was the best spot to drop the boat off so they can get upriver, but they only went there because they won Kilgore over and made him happy. It's another aspect of the hypocrisy that Kurtz is talking about. Kilgore's allowed to go wild because he still knows how to play the game and make his command happy. He represented the sort of shock and awe the public expects with war. It's why the air cav scenes are the only real battle scenes you get in the film. The loud, explosive war scenes everyone loves to see in these kinds of movies. Overwhelming strength in the face of the enemy. Kurtz loudly and publicly bucked against command, so any decision he makes is under much more scrutiny. Scrutiny that drove the man insane and led him down darker roads, because he represents the less fun aspects of war, the shady operations, assassinations, outright crimes against humanity. At first, he just wanted to help. He was sent in to vaccinate children, but he was faced with the fact the enemy will exploit that against him, to show unending cruelty just to prove they can be cruel. It's actually a common yet underappreciated aspect of the Vietnam War. America was put under endless scrutiny for its actions in the war. Stories of soldiers abusing Vietnamese villagers, killing civilians, covering up the actual death tolls for the war to make America look stronger, tons of things that played into the public despising the war, and treating a lot of the veterans that came back like absolute dog shit. Any of you guys that had family members who fought in Vietnam might have some personal experience on the matter. My granddad to this day despises the hippie movement due to how they treated him after he came back from the war, and you have stories like Rambo First Blood that specifically focused on the treatment of veterans after Vietnam. Characters like the Punisher were partially inspired by the state of society that a lot of veterans came back home to, with Frank being screwed over by an incompetent, apathetic, inefficient legal system that let them down. And the ironic part about all this is that the Viet Cong were equally guilty of all the crimes lobbed at America. They also tortured, they also raped, they also murdered civilians. Already talked about how the execution picture was not exactly the context they led you to believe. It was warped to win over people who had no idea how grisly war is by its very nature. Since the guy being shot murdered a man and his family and was found next to a fucking mass grave of civilians. It's a strange hypocrisy that the Viet Cong are held to a lesser standard than America. Hell, for years POWs were held in Vietnam long after the war, simply because they refused to release them, or even acknowledge that they were there. They still deny there was ever torture. The Deer Hunter, a film that talks specifically about how POWs were tortured by the Vietnamese, generated some controversy in Vietnam. The fall of Saigon had people clinging onto helicopters because they knew the incoming communist regime was going to kill a shitload of innocent people. And yeah, it did. Then they went to war with China, which made it all ironic. This is something the movie outright talks about. It's the entire point of Kurtz as a character, that if you're unwilling to become as bad as them, they will beat you through sheer attrition. If you do not wield moral terror as a weapon, it will be used against you. They are enemies to be feared. Now, this isn't saying Kurtz did nothing wrong, simply that he's operating off a state of mind that only somebody like Willard would understand. Pure sociopathic logic. Viewing people and situations as a number game with no consideration for humanity. Not because Kurtz is a sociopath and has no humanity, it's the opposite. He is such a humanist that he thinks he has to think like this, to become this animal in order to save more lives. Because when you're in a situation that they're in, humanity is not a factor. They were willing to cut the arms off children because they got vaccinated by America. They are willing to do anything. You see this with the boat scene, where they do a routine stop and check on a passing fishing vessel to make sure they aren't smuggling weapons. The scene is very tense. Chef refusing to jump off the boat and check out the Vietnamese one, since he's been riled by earlier incidents in the film and is scared of leaving the patrol boat. Chief demanding he go, and then Chef finally relents, acting very reckless and just jumping from container to container without actually looking at anything. He's pissed off and just wants them to leave. Well, when he gets to the back of the boat, it spooks the villagers for some reason. A young woman rushes towards him and clean executes everybody on the boat, spraying them all with his machine gun while Chef cowers in the back. He's destroyed by the incident, revealing that the woman just wanted to protect her dog. There were no guns on the boat or anything like that, it was just a group of fishermen. Well, it turns out the young woman is still alive, bleeding out from her wounds. The rest of the crew want to take her to a hospital to make sure she survives, and Willard just executes her.
The book says Captain...
Shooting her point blank, much to everyone's horror. Now really think about that. The boat crew just gunned down innocent civilians, yet Willard shooting the woman was a step too far for them, shooting a woman already bleeding to death, and they were the reason she was dying in the first place. Hell, they legally weren't supposed to be there. It was Cambodia, it was no longer Vietnam. They were under no obligation to stop and check out this boat. They had no obligation to investigate these civilians. Yet Willard shooting the woman was too far. He recognized the hypocrisy too, simply with the line, "I told you not to stop."
I told you not to stop. Now let's go.
Willard never pretends to be a good guy. He's not delusional and thinks he's a hero. He's fully aware of what he is and what he's doing. He even resents the boat crew for the incident, referring to it as a lie. They cut people in half with a machine gun and offer him a band-aid as if it fixed anything. Before the shooting, they're throwing the villagers around. Clean is calling them slurs. They're showing zero respect for these people. This happens a few times in the film, when the crew is hit with the real face of war and they shrink back in fear. The boat scene is one, the Do Long Bridge is another, where the situation has devolved into hell on earth, with Viet Cong and Americans throwing bullets at each other in complete anarchy as their command structure is all dead. Well, there's an interesting moment when Willard reaches the trenches. A group of machine gunners are trying to repel a wave of VC, and it seems like one guy just refuses to die, screaming "fuck UGI" over and over again. They resort to calling for a guy called the Roach to take care of it, a man with a grenade launcher that scarily contrasts the rest of the soldiers. While the machine gunners are high energy and panicked, Roach is very slow and methodical. He just gets up from his spot, aims his weapon, and kills the surviving VC. Willard asks him if he knew who is in command, and Roach just says, yeah, before he goes back to his spot. Roach is essentially this unit's Willard, or even Kurtz. Someone so at home at war that he's almost this ethereal outsider, like he doesn't even exist, and he treats the act of killing as so routine he doesn't even muster excitement for it. He's seen the same things, to the point you could immediately recognize him as another Colby, someone that, if given the opportunity, would 100% join Kurtz and be a part of his army. Now, it's pretty easy to assume Roach is just baked out of his gourd, and his actor, Herb Rice, probably was, but I never saw it like that. It's much more unsettling to think the character was stone cold sober. that this guy is acting like Lance, a dude who's tripping balls on LSD, but is completely untouched. He's drunk off his own thoughts. Too much time in the war and too much time to think turn him into this. Same with Kurtz, same with Colby, same with Willard. Apocalypse Now debates back and forth what a perfect soldier would look like. Would it be Captain America, a guy willing to do the right thing no matter what? Someone strong and brave? Or would it be someone more terrifying? A man willing to become a damn slasher villain because that's what they feel is necessary. This is something the movie wants you to think about. Kurtz is built up as the best of the best, a man able to complete special forces training at double the age they intended it for. He was well respected, beloved by his men, he even had a loyal wife and child that wanted him to come home. So the question is Kurtz the perfect soldier? His philosophy is around tapping into the human instinct to kill, without feeling, without passion, without judgment, to treat it like butchering an animal. The film wants you to consider this as you watch, to question why certain deaths are justified and others aren't. The obvious ones are there, stuff like VC opening fire on the characters and getting blown up by helicopters or torn apart by machine guns. That's the expectation of war. But what about killing a double agent? Someone you know is guilty and should die to save more lives. Should you just go and kill them without permission? Would it be right to punish someone who did? What about mercy killing a civilian your side wounded in the first place? The entire plot is the government sending an assassin against an American citizen without due process. The exact crimes they want Kurtz dead for to begin with. This is the ugliness the public likes to shy away from. Or it gets devolved into the most two-dimensional and easy to paint as evil that the real nuance is wiped away. Because that's the scary part about Apocalypse Now. Not that it shows the horrors of war, but to make you ask if the horror is necessary. That to win a war, you have to turn a blind eye to true evil because the bigger picture requires it. It's never a good subject to broach. And there are some out there who are full-blown anti-war pacifists, which isn't a bad ideal, but that's exactly what it is, an ideal. Reality is usually much harsher. Now, the obvious thing to talk about is the ending. When Willard is captured by Kurtz, we already talked about how the reveal of the character and his monologues are a haunting aspect of the film, but you finally get a chance to hear how Kurtz sees the world from his own mouth. There are other aspects of it as well to talk about. For one, the fact Kurtz doesn't kill Willard. He kills Chef, decapitating him and presenting a severed head to Willard as part of his capture, but he specifically keeps him alive, even having Will sit close by as he recites poetry and more monologues, as though he's giving a sermon to win him over, and Willard actually responds to it, sitting and listening to the words. We don't really know what's going on in his head, we just see him sitting and listening to Kurtz. His narration does come up now and again, and it's mainly Will's impression of the man now that he's met him. But instead of calling him a madman or brushing off what he's saying, he does seem to understand what's going on with Kurtz. He's a broken, tired man, someone torn apart by Vietnam and wants somebody to stop him. Willard does the one thing nobody else in the story does. He understands him. Not even his followers truly understand Kurtz. They just see a god king, a warrior poet that are swept up in the cult of personality. Willard sees himself in Kurtz, someone just tired, a man who can't decide what world he belongs to. A lot of people see the ending as Willard specifically fighting off Kurtz's influence, reasserting himself and his loyalties and not becoming one of Kurtz's thralls. That's not how I see the ending at all. For one, Willard's not the kind of character that gets a redemption arc. He's just not that kind of man. The way I see the ending, Will becomes the one true disciple. He was the follower that fully understood the leader. Kurtz liked Willard. He took him in and wanted to teach him, and the lessons did stick, just in their own way. Will saw through the words and knew what Kurtz truly wanted deep down. He wanted someone to kill him, to put an end to the madness. Even if war needed a monster to win it, Kurtz never wanted to be that monster. The way Willard talks about the situation is very revealing.
They were gonna make me a major for this. And I wasn't even in their fucking army anymore.
When Willard first meets Kurtz, he simply tells him he's a soldier. Now he's flagrantly saying to himself he's not part of the army anymore. Willard isn't reasserting his loyalties to America or anything like that. No, I think it's the opposite. He's accepted that deep down, Kurtz is right. There is a flagrant hypocrisy. These people are liars. There is this moral paradox that people just are expected to ignore. But he also knows that Kurtz wants to die.
You have a right to kill me. You have a right to do that.
Kurtz even allows Willard to kill him. The narration from Willard even points this out. Everyone wanted to kill him, Kurtz most of all. In the actual murder scene itself, you never see Kurtz fight back. He never tries to attack Willard, he simply lets himself be hacked to death with a machete. He was waiting for one of his followers to finally understand his words. Colby, ironically, failed Kurtz's teachings by not killing him. All he ever wanted was to die like a man, standing on his own 2 feet, not choking in the jungle from disease, not cheaply assassinated, but to face death with any single shred of dignity he had left. It's why he kills Chef, who was ordered to call in an airstrike if Willard didn't come back to the boat after a certain amount of time, because that's not how Kurtz wanted to die. He wanted to make sure someone knew the truth, and to take it back home to his family, of what Kurtz did, of what the war truly was, and that he died like a man. Kurtz was a good man trapped in his own body as he turned into a monster, and Willard finally set him free. The film ends with Willard and Lance, the only survivors, simply leaving the temple. The cult trying to gather around Will as though wanting him to be their new leader, because they recognize that he's a lot like Kurtz, but he rejects the position. They simply get in the boat and leave, with Kurtz saying the horror over and over again until the credits. Now, there is a lot of back and forth on why exactly Will decided to leave. Did he actually reject everything Kurtz said? Was this just him saying, fuck it, I want to go home? There's a lot of questions back and forth. My personal interpretation goes back to one of Kurtz's first monologues, when he talks about how you need to put out all judgment and all hesitation. When he talks about that, you have to remember Willard is under order to kill Kurtz. So even if Willard likes the guy and respects him, he has to kill him because he's been ordered to. So to embody that ideal Kurtz wanted, Will had to turn off his hesitation and his respect. You even get hints of it since the song playing during the final confrontation is The End by the Doors, which is basically tied at the hip with this movie due to how much they kind of mesh together. But the song The End is specifically all about the end of a relationship. Now, that can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and it's pretty much up to how you view the song, but there's a lot of synchronicities in regards to Apocalypse Now with how it ties into Will and Kurtz and their relationship. You can see it as Will ending his obsession with Kurtz now that he can finally kill him, or putting an end to a budding friendship, or at the very least, mentor-student relationship, and it's essentially Willard lamenting the fact that he's killing one of the few men that he can truly understand. Kurtz even specifically asks him to visit his family and tell his son everything that happened. Kurtz makes the request to the man he knows was sent there to kill him to tell his family what happened. In a much brighter timeline, they probably would have served together and been very good friends, but that's just not the reality that turned out for them. Still, that's Apocalypse Now, a story of human darkness and insanity that does not hold any punches in regards to its themes. It's a very bleak film, to the point that trying to ascribe any moral lesson to it is kind of a failed bet. The point of the story isn't good versus evil, it's understanding evil, realizing that it's something that's in everyone. Everyone has the potential to become an animal if put in the right circumstances. Sometimes it can even be necessary, or worse, someone can convince themselves it is. To think that a single deal with the devil is enough to achieve a greater good, without understanding it will lead to a snowball effect, which ends with somebody being unrecognizable, going from a kind-hearted, idealistic man to someone willing to cut off another man's head simply to prove a point. Apocalypse Now is a disturbingly cerebral movie. It truly wants you to think about what Kurtz is saying, to consider his words, and try to parse the meaning between them. It's easy to write him off as just a manipulative madman, but the terrifying part about Kurtz is that all he's doing is telling the truth. With this, we can segue into the point about the alternate versions of the film. So Apocalypse Now famously has a lot of versions to it, not just the ones that are publicly available, theatrical, redux, final cut, but there's a lot of versions that were only shown in certain theaters or showings, like the 70mm cut and things like that. There are over 1 million miles of footage that Coppola had to edit through. There is a lot of versions of this movie. But I'll focus on the main three. The theatrical cut is, well, the theatrical version, the one shown in the majority of theaters. It follows the main story and never deviates, unlike the other versions. Now, Redux is the longest version of the movie, clocking in at 3.5 hours long, and includes 3 major scenes that aren't present in the theatrical. The first one being a scene where the boat crew spots the Playboy bunnies from an earlier scene at one of the bases, so they talk them into having sex. It's funnier compared to the rest of the film, clearly meant to be a moment of levity before ushering in the absolute horror. And the second scene is the one that takes place after Clean is killed in an ambush. The boat crew trying to bury him stumble into a group of French plantation owners living in the jungle. They invite the crew to have dinner and give them a place to rest, where they discuss the history of the family and what they're doing in the region. You see that they're staying in Vietnam as a matter of pride. The French lost conflict after conflict, but they refused to give up this farm, even talking about how communist groups back in France sabotaged their soldiers by infiltrating infiltrating supply factories, giving them dummy grenades and bad ammo. The family's very bitter about the matter, and the patriarch begs the Americans to learn from them, that they have to win the conflict. They chose to fight it, so they must win it, no matter the cost. Otherwise, their spirit will be broken and they will never recover. It's an interesting moment, if considered a little slow, because it can drag a bit, since it's mainly the French family ranting. But still, it's a good scene that shows the mentality of somebody that absolutely refuses to give up, that has walked the road America already has and knows what they're dealing with. Now, the last edition is an interesting one. You get more scenes with Kurtz, particularly a moment where Kurtz reads the newspaper to Willard, showing the spin at play in the American media to make the war seem favorable for them. These people are willing to lie about everything and do all the things they condemn Kurtz for. Some say it's heavy-handed, that it's the film breaking character to deliver a political rant, but I don't really see it that way. I see it as more disgusting hypocrisy the film hinges on, that they want the public to see it all as clean and heroic liberation instead of the nasty hell that war truly is. They send thousands to their deaths, but are terrified of looking too impolite while doing it, and they will punish anybody that makes them look bad. It's an interesting enough scene. Now, this is all Redux. Final Cut has the plantation scene, but it doesn't have the Playboy bunnies or the scene with Kurtz. I recommend sitting down and watching all three versions at least once, since it's good to see how radically different each cut can feel at times. It makes you appreciate the version you like the most, and it gives you more to chew on and think about. Hell, the French scene in particular has had a lot of debate back and forth, mainly because it does discuss the issue of communist infiltration and the very idea of, hey, you're in the war, why won't you win it to make sure the lives lost are worth something? But hell, if you want to know an even crazier one, there's outright a 289-minute long version out there. It's never been seen, but it exists, and it has radically different elements, like showing Colby and the journalist die, stuff like that. The journalist, by the way, is played by Dennis Hopper, out of his fucking mind on coke, which helped him nail that manic energy that his character is kinda needed, since he's supposed to sound like a lunatic. By the way, the cameras he's using in the film are used by the author of Dispatches when he served in Vietnam. Kind of a cool piece of trivia. The point is that Apocalypse Now is sort of like Blade Runner. There's a lot of cuts for the film, and you should really sit down and watch as many as you can get your hands on, because they can reveal new aspects of the film and help you appreciate what you like about it most. And if you just want to stick to the theatrical version, it works more than enough on its own. It doesn't feel cut to pieces whatsoever, which admittedly is a problem with Blade Runner. Still, Apocalypse Now is a phenomenal film, one that makes you ask questions about human nature, war, and morality. It's something everyone who says they're a fan of movies absolutely needs to sit down and watch. It's practically required viewing. Hell, film schools show it off for students to study. It's a massive landmark for filmmaking, and you would be doing yourself a disservice if you never take the time to watch it, any version. Still, this is all I can say about Apocalypse Now. It's damn near a perfect movie. Something that absolutely isn't for everybody. It's insanely dark, but should be watched, just to say you've seen it. The impact it's had is almost impossible to describe. From games, books, comics, video games, other movies, there hasn't been a genre of media not at least acknowledge Apocalypse Now's existence. The Kill Fuck Die album from Wasp is shamelessly inspired by Apocalypse Now, with the song The Horror outright described as looking into the mind of Colonel Kurtz. I mean, the song is named after his closing lines. The end from The Doors is practically synonymous with Apocalypse Now when you think about it. It's one of those song choices in film that really does need to go down in history as just absolute pitch perfect, being just as iconic for the film as the dialogue. This movie is something that will continue to inspire and be referenced for God knows how long, because it's just fucking good. Sit down and give it a watch, you won't regret it for a second. Until next time, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. See you guys.
I loved you in Wall Street!
Hey loser, do you want a shirt? Do you want a t-shirt? I have shirts now. Look in the description for a link to a t-shirt you can buy. If you don't buy the t-shirt, I'll kill your family. If you don't buy the t-shirt, I'll poison your dog. If you don't buy the t-shirt, you're going to be the only person in town that does not have a t-shirt. Everyone's going to look at you funny. There's going to be social consequences to not having one of these t-shirts. I'm now making express threats of violence against you if you do not buy my t-shirt. I will call the police, tell them how they're not, you're not buying my shirt. They're gonna plant crack in your house, and they're gonna arrest you and then beat you up in a jail cell. Buy my shirt.